Hello, everyone. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for being patient. My name is Inbal GOLDBERGER. I am the VP of Trust and Safety at ACTIVEFENCE. We are a trust and safety company, and we enable trust and safety teams to keep their users and platforms safe. And with me, we have Jan EISSFELDT. Soon enough, he will represent himself, global head of trust and safety at the Wikimedia Foundation. And we have Jeremy West, head of digital security and safety unit at OECD. I'll be moderating this panel, which is going to be built around online terrorism. It's a heavy topic, quite disturbing. And last year, in 2022, 18,000 URLs were reported to Tech Against Terrorism, URLs containing terroristic content. Now, in terms of trust and safety, 18,000 is not so much. But because of the devastating impact of terroristic content, there's a lot of attention around it. And our discussion today will revolve around some of the trends that we see in terrorism online and around the challenges that we have in tackling this, and a little bit of solutions and some ideas how to go forward with this. So let's start with a little bit of trends that, before this, let's do a little bit of introduction and tell us about your role and how terrorism is part of your mission. Jan.
Does this work? Yes, okay. Well, I'm Jan. Thank you kindly for coming. This is a quite packed room. I didn't quite expect it, given the specificity of the topic. I run Trust and Safety and Human Rights for the Wikimedia Foundation, which is a global non-profit organization that operates charitable educational projects, including Wikipedia and Wikidata. So large scale, one of the top 10 web properties on the planet. And we have 383 languages, which means more than any commercial provider for obvious reasons, because we care as a charitable mission about bringing the sum of human knowledge to every person on the planet, where it also means that we have a particular level of complexity to navigate for topics of this area here today, as well as the broader issues that come with those items. Another thing that's quite useful to keep in mind as we're going through the session together today is that we also have a probably quite unique self-governance model, meaning we have volunteer communities that co-create collaboratively in public the content that you may be using every day on Wikipedia. Well, the Wikimedia Foundation, of course, is a technical platform provider, but is not following the centralized industrial scale model that creates, for the trust and safety lens, a lot of the vulnerabilities and challenges that we will be discussing here today on terrorism, but also on other kinds of issues. Instead, our communities do that themselves.
Just as an introduction, it's okay. I will get back to this later. And Jeremy, just introduce yourself and your role.
Right, got it. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. As Inbal said, I'm the head of the OECD's Digital Security and Safety Unit. Just quickly, in case you don't know what the OECD is, it's an intergovernmental organization of 38 countries that are all, at least in principle, like-minded democracies that believe in free market economies. Just quickly, how did we get into the online terrorism space? It's not our usual area, but the OECD is a place where, as the previous speaker in the last session mentioned, policymaking is done very deliberately. It's not a knee-jerk reaction kind of place. What we do is develop an evidence base to help policymakers, and we do take our time and are very careful about our evidence. And when we sensed there was a need for it in this area, that's when we got involved. So I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and pleasure to have you. So talented speakers that I know from before. So if we look at last year, 2022, everyone who researched terrorism, we see that there is a different use of platforms for facilitation of content that is terroristic. Anyone has an idea what is the most popular platform that is being utilized for the spread of terroristic content? like social media, messaging apps, gaming. Any idea what is the most popular? Just shout it out. So social media, what is the type? No. So actually it's file sharing. So think about, I mean, I won't finger point, but the Dropbox of the world, not necessarily Dropbox, but these file sharing are the most popular. So 61% of terroristic content is hosted on file sharing services. And beyond this, we have what is called TOW, terroristic operated websites. So websites that are just used by the terroristic organizations. And obviously, you mentioned social media. We have online gaming. Do you know it's a thing that we call it gamification of jihad or extremism? We have games online that mimic famous shooting. For example, the Christchurch shooting is mimicked in a game so that you can play it online. And also, of course, messaging applications. And when we look at this, we see interesting trends that happen in how online content is spread. And beyond this, we have many challenges around detecting terroristic content, defining what it is, and we talked about what is exactly terroristic content. I mean, in some other abuse types, it's a little bit more black and white, although we can argue, like, is child sexual abuse material? What is CSAM? What is child sexual? In terrorism, we know that there are some gray areas. So definition, what is the scope of the problem? How big it is? If we can't really measure it, how can we tackle it? And other challenges like how we collaborate, how we share knowledge, how do we enforce, what regulations we have, and so on. And this discussion will touch on these topics. So we will start with motivations. So why at all using the online sphere to spread terroristic content? And then we talk about manifestation. So what actually we see online. Then we talk about challenges, and we will finish with some solutions and the path ahead. So let's start with the why, with the motivation. Why terroristic organizations and individuals use the online sphere to promote their motivations? And Jeremy, tell me, what is this motivation about?
Well, I think there's at least a couple of different ways to answer this question. So let me start with the basics. Literally, why are they using the internet and online platforms and social media and stuff? The answer to that is the same reason that everybody else uses it, the same reason that responsible actors use the internet. It is lightning fast, it has a potentially huge reach, and it's cheap. So basically, it's an affordable megaphone, and that's why they're using it. Now, another way to answer the question is, what are they using it for? What purposes are they using it for? I have to be careful. This is powerful. So you've probably encountered terrorist or violent extremist content online already, whether you wanted to or not. If you haven't, I want to know what your secret is, because there is an awful lot of it out there. And one of the reasons there's a lot of it out there is that there's a lot of purposes that these bad actors want to achieve through the posting and propagation of this content. They want to glorify their acts, first of all. Wait, that wasn't... They want to glorify their acts. They want to radicalize people online. They want to then recruit people online. They want to tell their story and gain sympathy for their cause. They want to target certain groups and persuade others to hate them, persuade others that even acts of violence against them are justified. And they want to raise funds online as well. They are able to use the internet to coordinate their activities and plan them and carry them out. So it's quite a variety of purposes that are there for them.
Thank you. And it's interesting to see that, like anyone else, they use all these channels for recruitment, coordination, messaging, fundraising, as any other legitimate player in the online sphere. Jan, and thank you for this, Jeremy. Jan, I want to hear from you from the Wikimedia perspective. How do you, starting with, how do you define terroristic content, and how do you approach this? And I mean, after the definition and the approach, what do you see on Wikipedia?
It's a good question. So some of the points that Jeremy made, unsurprisingly, will feature in what I'm saying next. And the reason for that has a lot to do with how our communities think about the world and think about content on our platforms. So if you have ever consumed a Wikipedia article, probably most people here have, there are footnotes, right, everywhere, because our communities really like verifiable knowledge and they can point to something. So if you then think about constituting parts of a definition that Wikimedia uses on the community side and the foundation side holistically for what constitutes terrorist content, that is glorification of terroristic acts, content that can enable recruitment, content that can incite violence between distinct groups of communities in unstable, quite often sociocultural contexts. So standard definitions that you see in academia, but also in parts of the international sphere, feature quite heavily. And there is an ongoing dialogue between the foundation as a platform provider and the individual communities in Wikipedia language versions about what really fits their specific context, because what may be a very sensible definition on English language Wikipedia does not necessarily work if you have a conversation with Pashto language Wikipedia. So we've got to work through these items. And that approach, this collaboration, also guides how we deal with these issues on a practical level. Our communities, by and large, deal with these issues themselves. And when they have reason to believe that there may be retaliation if they touch these issues themselves, or it becomes too complicated, they bring in the foundation.
Thank you. Talk to me a bit about undisclosed paid editing, about more tactics that are being used.
Yeah, so in general, we see three different kinds of patterns of activities on our platform. The most concerning one, where the foundation becomes most involved in just lending investigative capabilities, is indeed paid editing. This means either people who belong to concerning groups, organizations, or networks who operate on our platforms. This is reasonably rare, because if you think about it from an intuitive level, a lot of distribution of this content depends on not being terribly visible. And Wikipedia pages are publicly available everywhere on the planet, and they sit on top of every search result. So we have some of those items going on, and that comes either as members of those groups, or because Wikipedia also happens to be a widely available service on rent staff members, rent contractor platforms like Upwork, where these groups actually go into regular commerce and rent people who can potentially work on their behalf, which adds an additional layer of complexity. The two other items are where actors of whatever nature threaten community members who work against concerning activities, where community members themselves become a target, or where threats against institutions or individuals out in the world manifest on our platform. These are the three large groups.
Thank you, Jan. I'll tell you what I like these examples, because they demonstrate that beyond the black and white, very clear to your face terroristic content, like, you know, the beheading videos that are like clear violation, there are so many nuanced, sneaky pieces of content, of terroristic content, that the bare eye cannot necessarily detect it. And what Jan just described, like these sneaky editing that just, you know, just sneaks in content that is terroristic, is much harder to detect, and you need much more sophisticated, knowledgeable person to say, oh, this shouldn't be here. And when we talk about huge scale of dealing with terroristic content and with content moderation, it's not very straightforward. The massive content moderators not necessarily understand the delicacies, the nuances, the languages, the cultural references to realize there's something going wrong there. And this leads me to more challenges. One is detecting. And Jeremy, I want to hear from you, from your standpoint in OECD. How do you understand, how do you see the kind of spectrum of challenges. What are the problems we are facing in tackling this beyond what just Jan mentioned, detecting it and understanding that we are facing now a terroristic content?
Hard question, and it depends on who you mean by we to some extent. We, it can be governments, we can be civil society, we can be people like Jan, and we can be academics and on and on. It could be users too. You alluded to several of the problems already, Inbal. One of them, it has to do with just defining the key terms. International bodies have been trying for decades just to reach an agreement on what terrorism is, and they still haven't done it. If you go around and look at the terms and conditions that the major online platforms have on their websites, you'll see all kinds of different ways of approaching the definition of terrorism, from actually flat out clearly defining what they say it is, to just tangentially referring to terrorism as part of a broader set of things, to not even using the word and having people just kind of assume it's part of a big superset of prohibited conduct and content. The reason this matters is when everyone's using a different definition in policy discussions and in terms and conditions and in transparency reports, for example, it is super hard just to get an idea of what the scope of the problem is, because you can't aggregate, you can't compare if everyone is using a different definition. Another problem, I would say from the online platforms perspective, is detection, which is another thing that you mentioned. You know, it's not always going to be so easy as finding a video where someone is committing an obviously terrorist act, blowing up a building or whatever it is. There are a lot of gray areas. You have to allow exceptions depending sometimes on what the intent of posting content is. It could be posted for journalistic purposes or educational purposes. It could be satire. This is tough, even for today's sophisticated automated detection algorithms. So it requires, the close calls require teams of people. And this creates more problems because we've got people around the world who are looking at these hard calls, and they're basically moderating the world's digital waste on a day in, day out basis. And we expect them to do that and not develop mental health problems. I mean, yes, there are programs in place, and some companies are really good about it, but this is basically what's happening, and most of it is a north-south problem. So that's a whole separate issue, a geopolitical one. One more problem I'll mention, and I could go on, I don't want to do that, has to do with the fact that even the good news sometimes turns into bad news. We've seen over time that the largest platforms are starting to do a better and better job of moderating terrorist content. But the result of that is that the bad actors are just migrating onto smaller platforms and building their own platforms. And that's harder for the big platforms to deal with sometimes, because what they'll do is they'll just post an outlink on a big platform. They won't have any actual terrorist content in the post, but there'll be a link to Telegram. Just sorry, Telegram, I'm picking on you, but kind of deserve it. And there you'll find the horrific content. So what do you do if you're a major platform with that? Do you just ban all links to that particular smaller platform? What if somebody posted a link to that platform and it just goes to how to bake a chocolate cake? Do we still ban it anyway? How do you define what a terrorist-operated website is? These are all problems that are created by this migration.
I'll jump in. this starting in a popular mainstream platform and moving to a smaller one is what we call using online platforms as gateways. And we see this as a tactics. You all know it. So you see this kind of, let's move to this to talk about it, or a link. And you mentioned that from an enforcement point of view, the bigger online platforms say, listen, there's nothing wrong in this link. The link, I mean, itself doesn't show any content, any disturbing content. I cannot remove it. But at the same time, kind of everyone understands that they are just being facilitated for as a gateway, which is indeed a problem. So thank you for saying this. Also, as you mentioned, as technology and online platforms become better in detecting, bad actors try to evade it. So, for example, they realize that logo detection is being used. So all of a sudden, many videos have all their logos of ISIS or other organizations blurred. So it will make it hard for classifiers to identify this. So thanks for highlighting the complexities and the challenges. Jan, I want to ask you, because again, Wikipedia is not the classic online platform that is being exploited, but at the same time, it is. You have a really interesting success story that is not very common, because again, when we think about terroristic content, we think about the gore videos, the violent videos. I wanted to talk to us about the kidnap of David Stevenson by the Taliban, and tell us how you detected, you realized there is a terroristic content, and how you manage this.
So David Rode, who some of the folks in the room may know, he has been a journalist in the US context for decades, actually got kidnapped by members of the Taliban in 2008. And was really interesting and potentially quite enlightening for that case as far as our communities were concerned. It was really a question of not publishing something, because there were reasons to believe that the group that held him and some of his companions while he was researching that book about the war weren't actually aware about the value that they had in that hostage. So the New York Times, which was his company at the time, basically started working with international stakeholders to see whether or not we could, keep this at the level of cases as an American, but not, hey, actually, this guy has high strategic value. And this came on discrete channels to our communities as well. Remember what I said about verifiable content? So our communities looked at, okay, is there verifiable sources that report on these things? A little bit, but it's not like the New York Times was talking about it or other large international media outlets, and there are hierarchies of what is a reliable source. And more importantly, is it notable about the article about that person? Of course, he had an article because decades of international high impact journalism, including Pulitzer Prize. So the communities very quietly reached a consensus among themselves, and this is really a core feature of our editorial process, to not add that to the article for the time being. And they sat on that quite intentionally because it was very low public interest to the world at large, but it was a very high level of risk to the individual involved who was the subject of a Wikipedia article. So it demonstrates, I think, that even if you have a very decentralized system where you don't actually work with a corporation, the foundation was not involved in that debate, they can reach, I think, quite sensible human rights prioritizing outcomes, not only where there's a question of publishing something, but also where on occasions like these, the edge cases quite often that become really difficult for definition purposes, withholding something temporarily can be solved to a good outcome. And once he was released, of course, the first thing that went into that article was 2 sentences about that. They're still in there. You can read them today, as well as a long debate about whether or not that was the right thing to do.
Thank you for this. And again, why I like this success story is that it conveys that when trust and safety teams deal with issues like terroristic content, it's not just about the detection and being smart and more sophisticated in identifying this, which has a whole world of complexity, but also these nuances of should we allow it, should we not, what is the kind of political atmosphere around it. So again, it's much more complex and much more nuanced than it seems on the surface. And we are 5 minutes before we have to finish. So I want to finish on a more optimistic note. We talked about the challenges of scoping and defining terroristic content and detecting and dealing with evasion techniques and collaborating and coordinating our own efforts. What would be your kind of optimistic view or just advice for these people and us as an industry on how we should approach it going forward? Jeremy, you can start.
As someone who's tried to improve the situation with most of the spare energy I could muster over the last 4 years, I think this is a problem that's not going to be quickly or easily solved. In order to do it, people are going to have to be sincerely committed to solving this problem and taking a methodical, long-term approach to fixing it, and recognizing it is not going to be easy, and they're going to have to make compromises and stay engaged and involved in this. I mean, I come from an organization that provides policy advice to governments. Of course, I'm going to say that a major solution has to involve research, better research. We have a problem right now with lack of information, or at least highly usable information coming from industry. I'm not trying to paint the whole group with the same brush. Some firms are really, really good about transparency. A lot of them aren't. Even the ones that are good about it all go about it differently, though. So it is extremely difficult to get a cross-industry or cross-company perspective on the problem, on what's being done about it, how effective it is, what the impact on human rights is. And this is holding policymakers back in terms of figuring out what the most sensible things to do are. And I don't want to say that the problem is only on the private sector side. The problem's on the public sector side too. A lot of countries are coming forward with regulations that will require transparency reporting. They're all going about it in a different way. So pretty soon, they're going to be looking at the same problem that they all face through different lenses. And that's going to make international cooperation actually more difficult. So again, we hardly have any time. I guess I'll stop there. I do see several little rays of light. I think there's a nascent reg tech industry coming along, and I'm really inspired by that. I think there's so much potential there for them to do good by making it easier and more useful for firms to make information available that is going to help everybody to work together to solve this problem.
Thank you, Jeremy. So what I hear is being determined, collaborate effectively across industry, and being more transparent. So thank you for this. Jan, what would be your optimistic note?
Probably quite briefly. So what the foundation, of course, will do is to continue to improve community self-governance and dialogue with our community stakeholders. But if you look on the broader horizon, I think there's some progress on the regulatory side in having more targeted regulation. That's a really powerful change. So if you think about the traditional approach to regulating the space, it was indeed like Jeremy said, regulators would come with a broad brush and say, well, all large platforms have to do X. But if you think about a key change the DSA has introduced, for example, and will ripple from there, I assume, is to actually look at the moderation model, right? Industrial centralized needs a different regulatory approach in order to deliver good societal outcomes than what we are doing, for example. There's much more smaller organizations and businesses that don't fit in either of these two quite paradigmatic buckets. They need to be somewhere in the middle. And there's some flexibility in these newer types of regulations that are rolling in. So that's a positive thing that will enable also to build better tooling, build better technical solutions. adjacent to what Jeremy said about transparency, I mean, everything the foundation does and our communities do is public. So if you want to build your stuff on top of our APIs, which are open, to just process taxonomies of issues, be my guest. I mean, everyone in large tech already does that. If you think about voice assistants, for example, if you talk to your Siri or your Alexa or your Google Assistant, you really talk to Wikidata if you're asking a knowledge question, which is our second biggest project after Wikipedia. There's nothing holding any of you back to build solutions that help drive civic process or industrial process or even public sector solutions that are partially informed by these things, but also, loads of other resources that are coming out of academia, etc. Go and build stuff.
Thank you for this. So what I hear is the self-governance approach, regulation, and again, being determined. So thank you for this. We didn't touch even on new technologies like generative AI that can create their own terroristic content. And we didn't talk about this complexity. My note would be invest in technology and being adaptable. So just kind of flow with where the industry is going and when the challenges are going, and just create new solutions. So to your point on go and build something, I would second this. With that, I want to thank you. We are on time, but maybe we can take one question to either Jeremy or Jan. So if you hand, just raise your hand. Perfect, very quiet audience. So thank you for this. And see you later.